You were never meant to hear this." That's how the last letter began, written in trembling ink by a woman who hadn't spoken aloud in 50 years. Buried inside a wall, wrapped in altar cloth, behind stone sealed by a priest who disappeared weeks later. They told you St. Margaret's was a sanctuary, but sanctuaries don't echo with screams in the dark. Sanctuaries don't turn young women into hollow-eyed vessels who forget their own names. This isn't a ghost story. It's something far older and far more deliberate. In the winter of 1847, 17 young women entered the hills of western Pennsylvania to dedicate their lives to God. By spring, only 3 were alive, and 2 of them would never speak again. The church sealed the record, but now the veil lifts. You've been told that religious orders exist to purify the soul. What they don't tell you is what that purification costs. St. Margaret's Convent was no simple abbey. It was a stronghold of suffering, a testing ground, a crucible, and for some, a portal. Built atop bedrock scarred by something older than America, older than Catholicism itself, the stone of St. Margaret's has absorbed centuries of ritual, and not all of it holy. The Sisters of Divine Mercy didn't come here to teach or heal. They came to perfect the soul through pain, to bury the body until only obedience remained. They believed discipline unlocked divinity, that suffering scrubbed the human clean. But beneath the discipline was something darker, the kind of darkness that doesn't hide behind evil. It hides behind virtue. They called it the examination, a midnight ritual reserved for the most pious novices. One by one, they were taken from their beds. Some returned changed, some didn't return at all. The others, those who came back with eyes that reflected candlelight like animals, those weren't the same girls who left. They had been rewritten. And you're about to understand how. But I warn you, what you learn tonight will not leave you. This isn't entertainment, this is transmission. Once the pattern is seen, it cannot be unseen. Keep watching only if you're ready to question the entire story you've been told about purity, sacrifice, and control. Because St. Margaret's was never about salvation. It was about selection. They told the townsfolk it was a flu, an outbreak, a tragic consequence of close quarters and harsh winter. But the doctors were never called. No burial records, no priest-led rites, just silence, sealed silence, as if the girls had never existed at all. But one girl left breadcrumbs. Sister Catherine Murphy, 21, Irish, educated, devout, but not blind. It was her letters, hidden in a false floor beneath the novices' prayer stalls, that tell the real story. She wrote like a woman trying to stay sane inside a system designed to erase her. Her words weren't just descriptions, they were confessions of terror. She wrote of screams muffled by hymns, of girls taken in the night, returning with vacant eyes and voices that stuttered in dead languages. She wrote of a chapel carved directly into the rock, older than the convent above, etched with symbols no catechism had ever taught her to recognize. Spirals that pulled your gaze inward, grooves in the floor that looked too much like channels for something to flow, and an altar, not a table, but a basin, with stains, old stains, deep stains. St. Margaret's wasn't performing Mass, it was conducting rituals. Mother Agatha, Sizol, her name alone sent tremors through Catherine's handwriting, wasn't just a disciplinarian, she was an architect of obedience. She spoke with the authority of Rome, but carried relics no Vatican would authenticate, wore robes stitched with threads so black it seemed to absorb light, quoted saints that didn't exist, and required silence in a way that made it feel sacred, not optional. But the silence wasn't peace, it was programming. You see, systems of control don't declare themselves openly. They wrap themselves in symbols of love. They wear the mask of salvation, and that's how they enter, that's how they get in. Not by force, but by surrender. That was the true purpose of the convent, not to teach, but to filter, to test which minds would break and which would bend. Catherine began to realize something the others hadn't. The girls who resisted vanished, but the ones who surrendered completely, they were kept, not for sainthood, not for heaven, for something else, something that required transformation. And that transformation began in the chapel. At midnight, they say prayer is communion, but Catherine began to see that at St. Margaret's, prayer was surveillance. Every moment of silence, every bowed head, Every whispered rosary was a measurement, a way to test who could be trusted and who needed to be broken. The convent wasn't a sanctuary, it was a system, a perfect psychological engine designed to strip away ego, identity, even memory. And the rituals? They weren't optional. They were filters. Catherine started keeping track of who was called to the chapel, always in threes, always at the same time, 12:13 a.m., not midnight, 12:13. That number repeated in sermons, in scripture references, in strange notations on the schedule board. It wasn't random, it was a marker, a key. 3 girls were called, 1 returned changed, 1 returned empty, and 1 never returned at all. It happened over and over. She began to notice things no one else seemed willing to see. Books that rearranged themselves, candles that didn't cast warmth, crucifixes where Christ's eyes seemed open. Most disturbing of all, the veiled sisters, always silent, always watching, their eyes visible only through small slits in their hoods. Yet those eyes never blinked, never, not once. And then came the dreams. Not normal dreams, not even nightmares. Messages. Catherine dreamt of an ancient city beneath the convent, flooded in red light. A throne of bone, a choir of women with no mouths. A voice, not hers, praying in her sleep. Not to God, but to someone else. Someone older. The words weren't Latin. They were older, sharper, her own mouth speaking them against her will. And always, always the same symbol. A spiral of thorns inside a circle of ash, branded onto the altar in fire. She tried to confide in one of the others, Sister Helena, but Helena just smiled a little too long and said nothing. Later that night, Catherine saw her standing barefoot eyed the chapel, in the snow, not shivering, just staring at the sky, eyes wide, mouth open, like she was listening to something. This wasn't religion, this was replacement. And Catherine knew they weren't making saints here, they were making something else. They always said the altar was sacred, but Catherine began to understand. It was never meant for worship. It was meant for exchange. Behind the stone, behind the scripture, behind the facade of obedience, something ancient was being fed, not in metaphor, not in symbol, fed. Catherine found the hidden etching just below the basin's rim, worn smooth by generations of fingers, carved so low it was nearly invisible. Vetera manent, sanguis est pactum, the old remain. Blood is the pact. This was no Latin rite. It was a contract, one that predated Christianity, preceded the church, and had somehow survived, buried inside it. There was a hidden room, just as Mary Agnes had written. Behind the altar, masked by a false panel and veiled in incense-heavy shadows, was a narrow passage, one Catherine discovered by accident during her forced cleaning duty. The passage curved downward, deeper into the bedrock than any chapel should reach. The smell changed, less musty, more mineral, and the air buzzed, like a place still waiting for something. It wasn't a crypt. It was a sanctum. The walls were alive with markings, etchings that pulsed faintly when her fingers brushed them. Catherine saw carvings of women, not in habits, but in robes with open mouths and exposed hearts. Always 3. One lifting her hands, one kneeling in blood, one looking skyward with no eyes at all. Beneath them, that same spiral of thorns. Always the spiral, always the blood. And then she saw it. A statue. Not of Christ, not of Mary, but something in between. A female figure, arms outstretched, but her hands ended in roots, her eyes blindfolded, but her mouth carved open wider than human. Around her feet were bones, hundreds, tiny, like birds, like children. This was what they were serving. Catherine understood then. This order didn't come to Pennsylvania to escape persecution. They came here to continue d'issue, something that had almost been extinguished by modern faith, something that could only survive in isolation, in obedience, in suffering, and they needed vessels, young, pure, educated enough to speak the words, but broken enough to say them without question. The final vow wasn't chastity, it was silence. And once taken, it could never be undone. It began with the bell. Not the chapel bell that summoned the sisters to prayer. This one came from below, a low, metallic hum that Catherine first mistook for a dream, But when she awoke with her hands clasped in the same strange symbol she'd seen carved into the walls, when she realized her knees were raw from kneeling on cold stone, she didn't remember walking on. She knew the ritual wasn't waiting for her consent. It had already begun, but her body moved before her mind agreed. At midnight, she rose. Her feet carried her down the hall. No one stopped her. Not the veiled sisters, not the watchful eyes of the dormitory statues, not even the other novices whose eyes were open, unblinking, as if in trance. Something had shifted. The silence was heavier now, expectant, as if the building itself knew she was getting closer. The altar room was already open. Catherine stepped inside, candle in hand, heart pounding like a war drum beneath her ribs. What she saw wasn't mass. It was communion of a different kind. 3 girls knelt around the basin. Their mouths murmured in unison. Not prayer, but something older, rhythmic, bone deep. Their skin was marked with ash, their robes damp with something that didn't smell like oil or incense. At the head stood Mother Agatha, her arms outstretched, sleeves hanging like dead wings. She didn't look surprised to see Catherine. "You were always meant to see, child," she said. "We don't choose the vessels. They reveal themselves." Behind her, the statue loomed, its eyes now open, glowing faintly with blue fire. Catherine tried to speak, but her voice cracked under some invisible weight, not fear, pressure, as if the very air demanded her silence. "You feel it now, don't you?" Mother Agatha whispered, stepping closer. "The pull, the old current. You've already begun the first rite. You knelt in sleep. You spoke in your dreams. You listen." And it listened back. She reached out, not to harm Catherine, but to anoint her. But before her hand could touch, Catherine stepped back. Not from fear, from clarity. She realized something dangerous in that moment. They weren't trying to turn her into a nun. They were trying to turn her into a door. Doors. That's what they were cultivating. Not disciples, not daughters of God. Doors. Catherine didn't sleep that night. She watched the others breathe in unison like they shared one heartbeat, their chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. She whispered prayers, but the words sounded hollow, like echoes in a cavern too deep for mercy to reach. By morning, a decision was made. She couldn't stay silent, not anymore. But here's what they never tell you about whistleblowers of the divine. They don't get to walk away, especially when the institution isn't protecting belief, but something older than belief itself. The next day, she requested a private confession with Father Heinrich, the traveling priest who came weekly when weather permitted. He was old, worn thin by years of sermons and sacraments, but still kind. Still human. She met him in the winter garden. The snow-muffled sound made it feel like they were standing inside a tomb of frozen breath. Catherine recited no scripture. She just told him what she saw, about the spiral symbols, about the midnight rituals, about the eyes that didn't blink, and the statue that wasn't in any church canon. When she finished, he didn't speak. Not at first. Then he simply said, "I was hoping you wouldn't be the one." Catherine froze. "You knew?" He nodded slowly. "Not everything, but enough. I've seen girls vanish here. I've seen their names erased from parish records. I've read letters from mothers that never got replies." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I did," he said, voice cracking. "Once, in 1839. The diocese sent me here to investigate after 3 deaths. I filed a report. I gave them names, dates, descriptions of things that don't belong in the church." He looked down at the snow, as if it too might be listening. "The record was sealed. I was reassigned to these hills, a permanent penance. They sent me." Catherine had long wondered who the veiled sisters really were, the ones who never spoke, who never ate, who never blinked. Now, she knew where to look. The convent's records were kept in a locked cabinet in Mother Agatha's study, an austere room choked with incense, lined with books that had no titles on their spines. When the older woman took her afternoon walk alone, always between 3 and 3:30 p.m., Catherine slipped inside. She didn't expect to find names. She expected coded ledgers, blank entries, maybe sealed correspondence. What she found was worse. The names of the 17 novices from that winter were there, but the files were incomplete. No final vows recorded, no transfer documents, and beside 14 of the names, a symbol. The spiral, always the spiral. But when she looked deeper, into the oldest volumes, ones whose bindings cracked when opened, she found files that predated even the convent's foundation. files that reference sisters with no family names, no birthplaces. Names repeated again and again across decades. Sister Meliora, Sister Fausta, Sister Crucis, always assigned to ritual duty, always marked with the same sigil, and always listed as active across nearly a century. No one lives that long. Unless they're not alive in the way you and I understand. Catherine flipped further, her heart pounding like a second heartbeat in her ears. She found entries for apparent death, rejected vessel, and sacramental absorption, failed integration. Terms she'd never seen in any catechism. The veiled sisters weren't just silent. They were preserved. Not by grace, but by use. She began to understand. They weren't watching. They were waiting. Guardians of the ritual, embodiments of its memory, flesh made archival, not quite human, not quite spirit, bound in a loop of obedience so old even time couldn't dissolve them. They were what came after. There are places in this world where architecture lies, where walls aren't built to keep things out, but to keep things in. St. Margaret's had such a place. The hidden sanctum wasn't beneath the altar, it was beyond it, through the spiral. A passage Catherine had once mistaken for a carved symbol was actually a key. The grooves weren't decorative, they were a mechanism, a trigger. She waited until the convent slept, until the trance-like breath of the novices returned to rhythm. She carried no candle. The spiral required darkness to open. It did. Stone slid with a groan like old breath, revealing a narrow archway that led downward into blackness, older than memory. No air, no echo, just pressure, like the weight of belief pressed into stone over centuries. She descended barefoot. The steps were smooth, worn not by time, but by use. And then it opened. A chamber, circular, enormous, carved entirely out of black stone that didn't reflect light. The air was warm, thick, vibrating with a low hum that didn't enter through her ears, but her bones. At the center, a pit. Around it, 12 thrones of stone, and in each one, remains, robed, veiled, unmoving, but intact, not skeletal, not mummified, preserved. Their faces had been sewn shut, mouths stitched with golden thread, fingers clasped in prayer or binding, and carved into the floor around them. The spiral, not a symbol, a circuit. The 13th throne was empty, and behind it, a wall carved in relief. It told a story, but not one found in any gospel. Women kneeling before a towering figure, eyes open, mouth devouring the sun, blood flowing from their hands, language pouring from their tongues like ink, and from their mouths, shapes, spirals, serpents, fire. This was no God. It was a conduit, an intelligence that did not need worship, only compliance, a presence that predates language. It didn't speak, it interred, through ritual, through silence, through surrender. Suddenly, Catherine felt it. Not fear, recognition. The spiral wasn't just a symbol, it was an invitation, a map, a pathway, and the 13th throne was waiting for her. No institution survives 2,000 years by accident. The church didn't just outlast empires. It fed on them, and some say it never served God at all, but a far older covenant, one written not in parchment, but in blood, stone, and silence. Catherine now understood. St. Margaret's wasn't an anomaly. It was a node, a single branch of an underground network woven deep through the bones of history, convents, cloisters, abbeys, all with their own sanctums, their own thrones, their own circuits. Not churches. Engines. The women chosen weren't saints in training, they were conductors. Flesh and faith antennae through which something else transmitted. And the veil, that wasn't a symbol of modesty. It was insulation. Each novice who disappeared had simply been converted, from person to vessel, from soul to signal. Once the final vow was taken, the self was overwritten. What returned was not what went in. She found the proof. In a sealed drawer, wrapped in cloth soaked with frankincense and myrrh, was a parchment, not a letter. A contract. Signed by Vatican officials in 1783. A mutual understanding between unnamed bishops and the keepers of the spiral path, promising land, protection, and secrecy, in exchange for maintenance of the ancient rites that secure the stability of faith across realms. Realms, not nations, not dioceses. Realms. This wasn't just about earth. It was about access. Convents like St. Margaret's weren't just cloisters, they were doorways. And the rituals, the thrones, The veiled sisters, security protocols. Catherine's hands trembled as she held the document. At the bottom, 13 wax seals, each marked with a different sigil. The last one she recognized. A spiral inside a crown dot. The same symbol she'd seen carved into the bishop's ring back in Philadelphia. They all knew. The church had struck a deal with something. When you stare long enough into the abyss, they say it stares back. But what no one tells you is that sometimes it recognizes you. Catherine left the sanctum changed, not in body yet, but her thoughts felt occupied. Her dreams echoed in voices not her own. She could hear the 13th throne calling. That night, she wasn't summoned. She walked there, alone. Through the empty halls, past silent sisters who never turned their heads. The veil between her and the secret world had lifted. She no longer had to knock. The door opened on its own. She stood before the pit in the sanctum, heart silent, mind alight. The thrones hummed, not with voices, but with hunger, anticipation. And then she spoke. Not in English, not in Latin, the words came unbidden, syllables scraped from the fossil record of language. Her mouth formed spirals, her breath curled. The stone at her feet responded. It cracked open, and within it, bones, severed veils, and a single object wrapped in red silk, a mirror, not glass, polished obsidian. And when Catherine looked into it, she didn't see herself. She saw us, watching, you, the ones drawn to darkness, to truth, to forbidden knowledge dressed as myth, the ones who always wondered why history feels incomplete, why some stories vanish, why certain names echo in your blood, even if you've never heard them before. Because somewhere, you have. You were born into a world already under its spell. Every cathedral, every institution, every oath of silence and stone, all built atop older things, not erased, hidden. Now listen carefully. If you've made it this far, the spiral already recognizes you. That symbol isn't decoration, it's designation. You've been marked as a seeker. But now you must choose. Comment below. I see the 13th throne. I do not look away. Type it twice, lock it in, seal it. Because this isn't just a story. This is initiation. And once your eyes are open, they never close the same way again. For weeks, Catherine had watched Mother Agatha move like a queen among ghosts, commanding with grace, veiled in piety. But now she saw it, not reverence. Possession. The real Mother Agatha, whoever she once was, had been gone a long time. What walked those halls wore her like a vestment. The change wasn't obvious to the others, but Catherine had entered the circuit. She had stared into the spiral, breathed its frequency. Her blood had started to hum when lies were spoken. She could smell the hollow behind holy words. And Mother Agatha reeked of emptiness. Catherine waited, watched, until the right moment came, a storm-soaked midnight when even the statues wept condensation. She followed Agatha through the convent's oldest corridor, one that didn't appear on any blueprint. She walked with purpose, not old, not frail, fluid. Down a stairwell hidden behind a shelf of sacred texts, past a door locked not with metal, but prayer, the kind of prayer that's chanted backward, that sours the tongue. Catherine whispered it, and it opened. Inside was no bedroom. It was a cell, circular, like the sanctum, but smaller, more intimate. The walls were covered with parchment, old vellum, inked in languages older than Rome, Hebrew mixed with Proto-Celtic, Phoenician scrawled beside Latin. All of it spiraled toward a center pedestal, where it waited. A mask, bone white, faceless, no eye holes, no mouth slit, and yet it watched. Agatha stood before it, arms wide. "My vessel is ripening," she said, not to Catherine, but to the mask. The circuit widens. The 13th throne shall be filled. And then it answered, not with sound, with feeling. The walls pulsed, the air thickened, and inside Catherine's mind, a presence unfolded, vast, serpentine, ancient. It wore no name, but it had many. In the Babylonian scrolls, Asher en Hael, in forbidden Vatican codices, Corpu, Seraphim exiliata. Among the desert mystics, simply the voice that binds. It had lived inside saints and monsters alike. Its purpose was continuity, a bloodline of will. to bend flesh into obedience, thought into pattern, belief into infrastructure. Catherine fell to her knees, not from fear, from recognition. The voice had spoken through kings and killers, and now it wanted her. But Catherine wasn't like the others. She hadn't come to serve. She had come to burn the veil from the inside. Most people think power is held in palaces, parliaments, and presidencies. But Catherine now understood the deeper truth. Power lives in the pattern, and the spiral was its root. In every major city she'd ever known, the pattern existed. Spiraled floor mosaics in Vatican halls, spiral seals etched into CIA black site architecture, spiral emblems in old Masonic lodges, Eastern Orthodox cathedrals, even certain military chapels. It wasn't just a design, it was a circuit, global. Religious institutions had been used to install this symbol for centuries, not as decoration, but as signal points, like laying down wiring for something ancient that was still being built. Not just spiritual influence, energetic governance. The spiral was a symbol of recursion, yes, but also submission, a perfect structure with no exit. Once inside, you move forever inward, thinking you're getting closer to truth, when in fact, you're being devoured. St. Margaret's wasn't a remote outlier. It was a node in a cathedral-sized machine built of people. And Catherine was now deep inside its mainframe. She traced every document, every letterhead stamped by the diocese. She found correspondences not only with Rome, but with offshore financial firms, think tanks, even biotech research centers. Funding, silence, trade. It wasn't about belief anymore. It was about control of the narrative, psychological engineering through myth. The idea of penance, of submission, of sin, repackaged and rerouted through sacred ritual into obedience infrastructure. The spiral wasn't killing faith. It was weaponizing it. Through hunger, through ritual, through vow. And Catherine saw the terrifying genius of it all. If you can turn a human soul into a spiral, you never need chains again. You only need a calling, the veil, the chapel, the throne. It wasn't a prison, it was a factory. And every Esther who disappeared, not lost, repurposed. Their silence, their suffering, their sacrifice fueled the spiral. And that power didn't just stay in the church. It moved through the world, into banks, into black ops, into boardrooms. Catherine had pulled back the veil. Now, the veil was looking back. It was never about belief, it was about alignment. The ritual, Catherine discovered, wasn't performed once. It was a loop, a living liturgy that reactivates in each generation. A convergence of blood, word, and geometry. A spiritual algorithm written in flesh and memory. And Catherine had just become the primary input. The 13th throne wasn't waiting to be filled. It was testing her. She found the Book of Alignment hidden behind the altar, inside a compartment sealed not with locks, but with vows. Words etched in ash and sanctified by centuries of repetition. Not spoken aloud, spoken inward. The book was not bound in leather, but skin. Its pages shimmered, not from gold, but salted blood, preserved by ritual inks made from crushed wasp venom and black myrrh. And within its spiraled text was the full rite. Not just instructions, architecture, 12 bodies, one empty throne, a voice drawn down into the chamber by invocation, sacrifice, and resonance. And then, unification. The voice enters the vessel becomes a conduit, the conduit becomes law. That's what Mother Agatha had done. Not summoned a god, but permitted an ancient system to inhabit her. Not possessed, integrated. It wasn't demonic, it was infrastructural, not evil in the fairy tale sense, but efficient. Catherine read the ritual aloud, once. Whispers replied, from the walls. The spiral circuit awoke, glowing faintly as if lit from beneath the stone by veins of fire. The throne stirred. Flesh moved inside veils. One lifted a hand, another spoke. Alignment achieved, the vessel consents. Catherine dropped the book, her body convulsed, not in fear, but in invitation. She saw visions. The Council of Nicaea not as debate, but as data encoding. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, not as tragedy, but as file deletion. The Inquisition, not as punishment, but system update. This wasn't religion, it was version control. A way to reset civilization every time it deviated from the spiral. And Catherine, she was being offered administrator access, to take the throne, to replace Agatha, to run the ritual or destroy it. But there was no third path. Once you know the spiral, you either turn with it or get broken by it. There are moments in a man or a woman's life that don't just define them, they define reality around them. Catherine stood before the 13th throne, hands trembling, not with fear, but with the unbearable pressure of decision. The spiral pulsed at her feet, a living glyph now activated by her presence. Each of the 12 veiled figures had risen, ageless, expressionless, waiting, not for her devotion, but her choice. The mask of Agatha sat atop the stone pedestal, its hollow face now lit from within by a cold blue glow. It no longer looked passive. It looked hungry. And then the voice returned, not in her ears, in her marrow. "You are ready," it said. "Not because you obey, but because you understand. The spiral is not worship. It is function. It does not punish. It corrects." Catherine saw what it offered. A seat at the center of every decision that shapes mankind. The power to direct institutions, rewrite scripture, erase resistance. To tune society like a symphony, one spiral at a time. No chaos, no hunger, no war. But at what cost? She would never laugh again, never love again, never doubt again, because doubt is disorder, and the spiral has no room for what doesn't fit its form. The 12 stepped forward, each removed their veil. What she saw wasn't monstrous, it was familiar. A scientist, a nun, a banker, a general, a therapist, a tech CEO, a bishop, a judge, an actress, a mother, a scholar, and a child. All of them had aligned, not possessed, perfected. The voice offered one final whisper. "You will not be ruled. You will rule. Not as queen, but as system." Catherine lifted the mask. It felt weightless, like it was meant for her, but she paused, because deep in the spiraled pages, she had found a final clause in the right. If the vessel breaks the loop with full knowledge, the circuit collapses. No war, no fight, just a choice. See, and so she asked herself the question, is it better to be a god inside the spiral, or a human who burns it from the root? The mask fell from Catherine's hand and shattered on the stone. Silence. Then, screaming. Not from mouths. From the walls. The spiral recoiled. Thrones cracked. Candles extinguished with a hiss like snakes drowning. The 12 figures dropped to their knees, not in worship, but in agony. The circuit was broken. Because someone chose to remain human. And that was the one thing the system could never absorb. Catherine began to recite the unbinding vow, a passage whispered only in footnotes, buried in banned monastic texts, a spell not of magic but of defiance, a sequence that unraveled the spiral's logic from within. Not my will be bound. Not my voice be silenced. Not my soul made circuit. I remember the shape of the world before the spiral. The obsidian altar cracked. The ritual collapsed in on itself. And with it, the veil lifted. Suddenly, Catherine remembered everything. The other convents. The children born under the spiral's symbol. The world leaders marked not by bloodlines but by initiation. The televised lies. The financial markets. The sacred holidays. All pieces of a single vast operating system. Human history had been curated, not by victors, but by the spiral. It didn't want slaves. It wanted belief. Willing participants. Silent acolytes who mistake comfort for freedom. Ritual for truth. But Catherine's refusal became a rupture, a signal. To you. Yes, you. Watching. Now that you've seen the story, it's not just content, it's contagion. And here's the last truth. The spiral doesn't die when it breaks. It splits. One half returns to silence. The other spreads. And it's spreading through your screen right now. You feel it, don't you? The suspicion. The chill. The knowing. That sacred institutions can be machines. That prayer can be code. That rituals can build invisible prisons. And that history, your history, has been edited for